So this talk is called The Urgency of Intersectionality for Addressing Systemic Inequities in Higher Learning. And it's something that I know I do talk a lot about in terms of my teaching at the University of Calgary at the Workman School of Education. I just want to give an overview too of what we're going to be looking at today. So in her 2016 TED Talk called The Urgency of Intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, the African-American law professor who coined the term intersectionality, observed, quote, "We all know that when there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem, and when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it," end quote. The problem Crenshaw is talking about here is multiple forms of discrimination based on layers of difference. I will define what it means to take an intersectional approach when supporting the learning needs of students enrolled in contentious courses that actively address equity, diversity, and inclusion. As you know, that's abbreviated to EDI, as we all know, issues. The Workman School of Education's undergraduate course, Diversity in Learning, has been held up as an EDI exemplar. And I will be drawing from my experience leading this course to talk about the ways that we can all move towards inclusive and equitable teaching practices. I will conclude by overtly addressing the toll that such work can take on those of us who actively teach EDI topics and what allies can do to support us. So we've already had some, it's important to when we have talks to talk about the definitions, make sure we're all on the same page. And luckily for us, the University of Calgary's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion has defined many of these terms already. And it defines equity as, quote, a principle, condition, process, and outcome rooted in human rights and the inviolability of human dignity. It is integral to the legal principle of justice and the ethical principle and practice of fairness, end quote. Inequity, then, is an unfair situation that disregards human rights and dignity. We're all connected to the Academy here in some way or another, so I am sure that you can probably imagine some examples of systemic inequities in higher learning. So before I go on to the other slides where I do talk about that, let's just talk together. Let's take a moment here to brainstorm some of these together. Think of systemic examples of inequity that relate to or affect the entire post-secondary system, including its most basic operations. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that. Some of them should come to mind for many of you who do this type of work already. You can unmute your mic so we can hear your beautiful voice. It'd be really lovely to have some interaction, or you can choose to use the chat function. What are some inequities that come to mind when we think of the post-secondary institution?
I'll jump in.
Thanks, Simon.
I'd say access to post-secondary institutions, period.
Exactly.
Is the first thing I think of.
Yes, beautiful. Well said. Can you elaborate a little bit?
The rising cost of post-secondary education, access to resources in general. Yeah. I think all of those things get in the way, act as a severe barrier.
Yeah, and isn't education supposed to be that great leveler, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's turning out to be the opposite, unfortunately, right?
A really good point. Yes, thanks for sharing that, Simon. Are there other thoughts that people can think of that come to mind as some inequities that we can readily see even before entering the academy, as Simon mentioned, or while we're in here? What are we seeing that we would consider unfair, as according to that definition?
May I talk?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there are some inequities related to gender, and especially when you are married, when you have kids. There are some things, for instance, you have to have the baby, you have to give birth to them, you have to you have to do all your work, and everything is the same, grading and everything, you know. I think it's somehow inequity
Yep,
and mhm,
definitely. And your name is pronounced, is it Shabu?
yes, Shabu.
Shabu. Thank you so much for
Mhm.
sharing that. We are going to be talking a little bit about that. It's one of the obvious ones. Gender
Thank you.
inequities. Yeah, beautiful observation. And you know, the extra work that women have to bear. And I'm just looking in the chat. Some people have been, Ivy Young has mentioned that scholarships and admission based on GPA. Yes, definitely. Did you want to elaborate at all? Or if you want to turn your mic on, you're certainly welcome. Then we have also the lack of understandings of power imbalance. Yes, when supervisors ask students to do more work than is fair. That is not supposed to be happening. I'm a supervisor and there's only so many hours that graduate students can be working, so they should not be asked to do more. Simon's saying, great point. Yes, access based on gender, race, ability, and privilege. Very good point, Annie. Nice. And I second Ivy's comment, Sarah's saying, also in terms of assessment, lack of diversity and modalities. Yes, well said. Extracurricular activities, Elizabeth is saying, some students need to work, can't attend lectures, yes, workshops, networking events, etc. Although I think a lot of things have been, you know, with the online learning, there's a lot more flexibility, isn't there? We try to do that, try to attend to that by language. Shabu said, of course, language can be discriminatory. Absolutely, yeah. Okay.
Tonya, can I just add to say that grading can be
Hmm.
by race as well? You know, sometimes some people feel certain people from certain race
Oh, yeah,
should
Grace.
have A.
Oh, okay, really? Wow.
Yeah,
So they've
I
actually stated that to the professor, like, hey, I'm from over this part of the world and I should get A's.
yeah, it's like, you know, this part of the world, okay, they have a right to A, and the other part, they have to work and do like twice the work of what the others do before they can get a B plus or even an A.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that is
Interesting.
very common.
Oh, I'm glad that you shared that, Grace, because I've had a lot of students talk to me about why they should have an A, but they've never told me it's because of where they're from. Although when I used to teach high school English, I was working out in rural Alberta. It was very challenging, let me tell you. And one of the students said, hey, you know, you got to know that we're the McNivens. I'm like, like there's somebody their last name. And then I'm supposed to know that they're like the homesteading family from way back and la-di-da-di-da, the really important people, i.e. we're supposed to be marked in a certain way is what the impression was that I was given back then. So that was flabbergasting for me. You know, never saw that before. So yeah, the types of assessments too, there should be more flexibility in that. You guys have some excellent ideas and thank you for sharing those. And so I'm going to elaborate on some of them here with the following slides. Alrighty, so this one here says, it's talking about classes in the academy. And this is something that Simon was getting at earlier about like who can even access the university, right? So one obvious example that comes to mind for me is the academy's over-reliance on the precariat. You guys have heard that word, right? It's a combo of proletariat and precarious work. Precariat class of scholar who must exist without employment predictability or security to support tenured faculty members without whom the entire system would collapse. In 2018, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, CAUT, C-A-U-T, issued a report about the contract academic staff. So they're also like officially known as contract academic staff that says, quote, for a substantial number of survey respondents, part-time teaching is precarious work characterized by income insecurity, exclusion from career development, and unrecognized and unremunerated contributions, end quote. The COUT report also says, quote, the portion of university, college, and polytechnic teaching staff in these types of non-permanent teaching positions is increasing relative to those in permanent, usually tenure track positions. This phenomenon is difficult to study because the institutional data to do so is hard to obtain, curiously guarded, and changes each year. Because of this, contract academic staff are often referred to in the research literature as hidden academics in the post-secondary labor force. Not only are their numbers unknown, their experiences are also in the shadows. It's a classic proletariat versus the bourgeoisie scenario playing out in front of us every day, in which a growing class, if you will, of instructor has been created in order to serve the academy, but whose work is systematically undervalued and unrewarded. So I'm sure we all were quite well aware of that one. Racism in higher learning. Another example is how a person's race or ethnicity differentially affects their experiences and outcomes in post-secondary education system. Institutional racism is supported by a system of white supremacy. I know that words, those two words can be alarming for some people. Lots of images come to mind here, but I'm not referring to the extreme hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and other local groups that go by the names of Aryan Guard and Soldiers of Odin. I'm not referring to that. Instead, I'm referring to the everyday pervasiveness, magnitude, and normalcy of white privilege, dominance, and assumed superiority. So what this means is we do see a lot of white people in positions of structural power in post-secondary institutions. Institutional racism, this is what we were getting at earlier. Some of you already mentioned, sexism that was already mentioned. Similarly, institutional sexism operates strongly in higher learning, supported by the overarching ideology of patriarchy, another triggering word for a lot of people, which is simply the belief in the inherent superiority of men and male norms. The structure of higher education is has provided restricted employment, career, and leadership opportunities for women who continue to be underrepresented in senior leadership positions across a range of disciplines, earning considerably less than their male counterparts. Research examining the careers of women in academia has long found persistent family-work conflict, which is what we're getting at there about children, raising children while being a mother and an academic. This has been exacerbated, of course, as we all know, by the COVID-19 pandemic. Recent studies have deftly captured how increased home demands on academic mothers due to the pandemic, such as caring for young children and being responsible for remote schooling, has interfered with their perceived capacity to meet ideal academic norms. In academia, gender and the presence of young children at home were the most significant predictors of research disruptions. Okay, so we must not overlook life outside the academy, and we must be careful not to conflate equity with equality. Equity means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Take a look at that image on the left there. Those boxes as three people are standing on are equal. They're the equal height and size, right? Equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. So that, yeah, that's what I just said there. Yeah, and equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates appropriate resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So then you add a few boxes there to enable people to see over the fence so they can watch the game that way. And then there's the other one where they just remove the fence and then you can actually see the game through the fence. And it's a little bit more level playing field. So the systemic barrier has been removed in that case. So those are some of the things that a lot of you already mentioned before we were just chatting there. So intersectionality, what is it really? So as we've discussed briefly together, there are many examples of inequities in higher learning. These three about class, race, and gender that I've singled out here cannot be fully understood until we consider them in relation to one another, which brings us to the concept of intersectionality. And since we're all involved in the academy in some way or another here, you've likely come across this term. And you may have even been invited to examine your various privileges in some classes or somehow, somewhere at the university. So let's take a moment here to check our collective understanding of intersectionality. So what do you already know about intersectionality that you would be willing to share? You can use your mic. It's so nice to hear your voices. Or if you wish, you can write something in chat. Thank you. Sophie, go ahead.
Yeah, I can say a few words. I
Sure.
think when I think of intersectionality, it really comes in the context of like, you can't define someone or someone's experience in binaries, and that there's a lot of different intersections between someone's identity or like state of privilege that impacts like their ability or perspective or like capacity for different tasks. So
Okay, nice. Well said, Sophie. And I'll just add to that that it's not just identity singular, but the many ways that the many ways a person identifies. So, like those images on the screen there, you might identify with your sexual orientation, your gender expression, political affiliation, those sorts of things, and how they overlap. And there's lots of excellent points in the chat. Let's just take a look. The idea that Simon says that everyone brings with them unique perspectives that should be considered, absolutely. Various portions, of our individual identities and how aspects overlap with each other. That's from Sarah. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And then the intersection of various identities, traits that society uses to categorize people. And a shrug there. Not sure. Yeah, that's right. We do have different categories about how to define certain people. And Annie says, different identities that result, or our different identities that result in discrimination or privileges. Yes, people that experience discrimination because of their particular identities, right? Okay, good. You guys already know that. And you know what? You're supposed to know it because we're at the university and that's one of the places where this word is used a lot. But, there are critiques of intersectionality, commenting on the federal government of Canada's speech from the throne in 2020. Our Alberta Premier, Jason Kenney, called intersectionality a, quote, kooky academic theory, end quote. Some conservative politicians and right-wing media have critiqued intersectionality as everything from a, quote, conspiracy theory of victimization, end quote, to creating a, quote, new caste system, end quote. However, in a May 2019 interview with Vox, Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal scholar who coined the term in 1989, said intersectionality is not about creating a hierarchy with the most oppressed people at the top. So it's not about that. Okay, so that's what some people say it is, that's not what it is. Rather, she said, the point of intersectionality is to make room for, quote, more advocacy and remedial practices, to create a more egalitarian system. So essentially, it's just creating more room for different voices to also be heard, in addition to those who have quite a lot of privilege. Let's hear from others that have different experiences. Okay, so that's all that's intersectionality is about. Why is it so urgent? Why is intersectionality so urgent? And why is it so urgent for addressing systemic inequities in higher learning? So a person called Anne Sisson-Runyon, she's a professor of political science and a former head of women's, gender, and sexuality studies, observed that in our current political and cultural moment, deeper intersectional insights and actions are needed now more than ever. She wrote, quote, as a structural and relational theory and a method or analytic tool, intersectionality is poised to reveal both the intersections of institutions, systems, and categorizations that produce oppression, and the intersections of identity categorizations within individual groups. Ideally, intersectionality can disable hierarchical exclusions and enable peoples subjugated in different but connected ways to coalesce around more expansive agendas for social and ecological justice, end quote. Okay, sorry, I'll see you later, Ivy. Bye. Understanding intersectionality as the ways we or others simultaneously occupy both oppressed and privileged positions is essential to combating the interwoven prejudices people face in their daily lives. So that's why it's so urgent. It's important to understand if we're going to try to change anything. Let's now turn our attention to what it might mean to take an intersectional approach when supporting the learning needs of students enrolled in contentious courses that actively address equity, diversity, inclusion, EDI issues. The Workman School of Education's undergraduate course, Diversity in Learning, has been held up as an EDI exemplar because it underscores how inclusive teaching involves creating equitable and welcoming educational environments that prepare pre-service teachers for the diversity of the 21st century classroom. I will now draw from my experience leading this course to talk about ways that we can all move towards inclusive and equitable teaching practices. Diversity in Learning explores EDI issues in education from a critical social justice perspective. A critical approach to social justice refers to specific theoretical perspectives that regard most societies as stratified, so i.e. Divided and unequal, in significant and influential ways related to social groupings, as we were talking about earlier, such as race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and ability, among others. It's not an exhaustive list there. Course readings are informed by critical social justice theories that explore power and privilege in educational contexts, with a view towards thinking critically about the social context in which people teach and learn. All right, so the main assignment in this course is called Action for Social Justice and involves turning abstractions into a direct and concrete experience by participating in a diversity experience outside of class. Fazia knows this well. She used to teach this course, so we can talk about that too. Some of the course objectives include consciousness raising, examining the meanings and implications of action and inaction, and appreciating difference. It is considered important to connect with others who have different beliefs and or identities, and engage in educational dialogue with individuals of different identities, beliefs, and or cultural traditions. Students are asked to locate and attend an event that they identify as an area for potential personal growth in order to envision actions that they might take for social justice. Students are asked to attend an event that will allow them to critically examine taken for granted norms, and they are asked to attend this activity alone. Projects can take many forms and primarily involve participation at a pre-approved event or events, and the potential for profound learning and understanding is reliant on students' ability to interrogate their own identity and areas or communities or concepts about which they would like to develop a more open mind. So that part is essential. We always, those of us who teach this course, we ask people to really dig deep and think about what is an area that you know that you have some learning to do, that you might already be aware that you have some prejudice about a particular group. So that would be the group that you would want to explore and learn about so that you can work better with that group when you're working with them in a very diverse setting like a classroom. The Action for Social Justice assignment is especially illuminating for students from the dominant culture who do hold a lot of privilege. And here I'm going to share with you a couple of examples from the most impactful topics that students from the dominant culture have explored. World Hijab Day and LGBTQ literacy. So the World Hijab Day recognizes millions of Muslim women who choose to wear the hijab and live a life of modesty. It's a way to foster religious tolerance and understanding by inviting women, that's non-hijabi Muslims or non-Muslims, to experience the hijab for one day. The education students who have taken part in the World Hijab Day found it to be a memorable, even visceral experience that opened new pathways to understanding for them, which eventually counteracted some of their prior beliefs and controversies surrounding why Muslim women may choose to wear the hijab. Also popular is trying to understand gender and sexual diversity, and that's been popular among some of the male education students that I've taught over the years. Some choose to volunteer for Camp Firefly. I know that image is kind of small there, but that's a little cartoon that was drawn for Camp Firefly, which is a local leadership camp for LGBTQ youth in Alberta. And others volunteered to assist with the school's Gay-Straight Alliance. Some chose to attend a drag show to gain a better understanding of just one aspect of the LGBTQ communities and shed a few of their long-held homophobic beliefs. And then there's some Black, Indigenous, and people of color, abbreviated to BIPOC students, and those who are otherwise considered diverse because of their disabilities or sexual orientations or other matters, did not immediately see the potential of this assignment for them. Sometimes they were a little bit stumped by it. But once we talked about how members of marginalized groups do not necessarily have the lock, so to speak, on diversity, and could still learn a lot by exploring another marginalized group, they got excited about the assignment and created some fantastic action for social justice projects around topics like class and religious diversity, for example. Some students volunteered to serve lunch at the Calgary Drop-In and Rehab Center or the Calgary Mustard Seed to examine classism, racism, and poverty. And others attended an interactive session called Diverse Abilities as part of a UCalgary's EDI week to explore their relationship to ableism. And others chose to visit a Sikh Gurdwara called Dashmesh Culture Center to learn more about religious diversity, anti-racism, pedagogy, and multiculturalism, and their implications for teaching. Taking an intersectional approach to an assignment like this means building flexibility into the description of it that allows students to propose an alternative assignment that still achieves the same objectives. So that kind of touches upon something that someone wrote in the chat earlier about how sometimes assignments can be quite rigid and they're not very open. So in education, we do try to make sure that students can propose an alternative assignment. That's there. For some BIPOC students, it can be difficult to have to witness their white classmates learn about different forms of oppression that they experience daily. So that does come up in the class, and it can be very difficult to teach at that time. So it can be uncomfortable bringing to the fore topics that many feel are best tamped down. And for other BIPOC students, however, it can be liberating to see their white classmates finally learn about their privilege and talk openly about classism, racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression. So I know diversity and learning is not an easy class to take for those reasons I just mentioned, and it's certainly not an easy class to teach. I've been teaching this course since I was first asked to design it, earlier iterations of it, because it's changed quite a bit over the years, back in 2012. And I still make sure to wear a t-shirt under my long sleeve shirt because I know I'm going to sweat when talking about oppression, power, the structural nature of racism, white supremacy, and about homophobia, transphobia, and heterosexism. Those days on those last points are pretty challenging for me because I do identify as a lesbian, and it's challenging to hear students make overt homophobic remarks because they've been normalized or socialized to do that. So it's hard. It takes some skill. So as the coordinator of this course, I organize meetings and workshops about teaching difficult topics for the members of the teaching team that teach the 12 or so different sections of it. So I fielded emails from instructors struggling with resistant students. And I also know that some BIPOC instructors gave up on teaching the course because it can take a personal toll, like I was getting at. But I also know, however, that some BIPOC scholars regularly actually look forward to teaching this course because it can be a form of vindication, a vehicle, if you will, for resistance and liberation from oppressive structures. Constantly teaching against the grain can have negative repercussions on an activist, academic's mental health and well-being. And so we would do well to remember Black lesbian feminist poet and civil rights activist, pictured here in the center, Audre Lorde's view about self-care. Quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare," end quote. So if you're a BIPOC teacher scholar, find ways to prioritize preserving yourself because your presence is needed here. This is also true if you're a scholar with a disability, a member of LGBTQ communities, non-Christian, or the first in your family to become an academic, whether that's as a student or as an instructor. I had to engage in some serious self-care myself recently due to some anxiety that I was experiencing after receiving a death threat upon the publication of my most recent scholarly book about homophobia and transphobia in Catholic schools. And I'll just show it here. I have it right by my desk all the time to remind me that keep going, keep doing the work. Because basically, if I'm not well, I cannot be of much help to others. And I cannot be that activist academic that I was hired to be. So it took a lot of courage, but I'm happy to say that I did reach out for help and I did get the care I needed when I needed it. So you might be wondering, how can you incorporate intersectionality into your work here at UCalgary? No matter what your role is at the UCalgary, you can always work to be a more intersectional ally. And here are just a few ideas. And I know that we're not supposed to put that much text on slides, but I thought I'd put these up, all these words here because it's important to keep these in mind. And for some people, it might be new. So I'm just going to read this for you. Look just beyond your skin color, middle class, university level education, able-bodied, cisgender. Like, ask yourself these questions. Like, what are your subject positions? All your social identities play into your privilege, even if you didn't ask for it. Like, we have nothing to do with that, right? It's just how we are socialized. Reflect on these and consider how this impacts the discriminations you do and don't experience, right? Listen and learn. This is an important one that we might have been taught, or in elementary school, but we somehow forget sometimes. At its very core, intersectionality is about learning to understand views of others. Listen to, include, and meaningfully collaborate with diverse groups of people. Hear and honor their words. But remember, it's not the responsibility of marginalized groups to do all the work of educating others. This often takes up a lot of emotional labor and could never be taken for granted. It should never be taken for granted, actually. So be prepared to help undertake some of the labor by doing your own research. Educate yourself about groups that you have been separated from. Build authentic cross-group relationships. And here's some more ideas. Make space. Ask yourself if you're the right person to take up space or speak on certain issues. Center stories and actions on those with the lived experience. Don't speak for others and don't speak over others. Have humility and admit to not knowing. Invite other voices in. This happens a lot with professors that are asked by media to speak about some topic, and they would like to get their name in the limelight. So they say, oh, sure, I can talk about that. Instead of actually saying that, no, this scholar down the hall is actually specializing in that and you should ask that person. So that's one example of making space. Watch your language. So many of the words that we use every day are ableist, exclusionary, and offensive to marginalized communities. When was the last time you said, that's so lame, or that's crazy, when you were annoyed about something? Consider how someone with a physical impairment or a diagnosed mental illness might hear this. Recognize and correct your use of such terms. Take responsibility for mistakes. By avoiding language that assumes our own experiences are baseline, we can open ourselves up to listening to others' points of view. And so I opened this talk by referring to UCalgary's webpage for the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. And I would like to leave you with these last slides that I've got here, with some ideas from the other sociologist, Dr. Zuleika Zavalos. There's different ways of pronouncing her name depending if you're speaking English or Spanish. A Peruvian Australian applied sociologist living on Gadigal land, which is also known as Sydney in Australia. To start reviewing your organization's equity, diversity, and inclusion strategic plan. So you can look at UCalgary's strategic plan when you think about these ideas, or other organizations that you might be part of. Publicize and review policies and practices. Note, policies that meet legal requirements are the bare minimum and have not worked to change the gender landscape. Publicly commit to critical and ongoing evaluation and revision of policies and practices. Publish a clear summary of policies on the organization's external-facing website. Make available detailed policies in plain language, not legalese or not in HR speak. Adopt gender-inclusive language as standard practice. Review policies using phrases such as all genders rather than men and women. Embrace gender-inclusive pronouns such as they rather than he or she. And consider going beyond pronouns to include mental and physical health issues. Analyze equity, diversity, and inclusion and publish the results. Collecting numbers about, quote, men and women does little to shift the dial on racism, ableism, ageism, classism, homophobia, and transphobia in organizations. Use an intersectionality framework to evaluate how faculty, staff, and students understand and experience gender equity issues. Create a transparent plan for change that can be easily accessed by all. Use intersectionality to overhaul decision-making, resource allocation, improvement of services, and representation. Foster a climate that welcomes and values the safety of minorities, especially those from equity deserving groups, over and above the comfort of white people. Provide funding for cross-disciplinary groups, especially women of color, Indigenous and Two-Spirit groups, to widen their networks of support. Respond rapidly and unequivocally to remove racial injustice, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and other forms of exclusion. Prominently showcase equity-deserving groups across the organization at all levels, including the physical environment. Update portraits and artwork on walls, names of buildings, rooms, provide gender-neutral washrooms, include preferred pronouns. I'm sure you can think of some other suggestions. Develop explicit guidelines and set processes for funding that consciously take into consideration biases in the publication system. Consider who gets to make the rules of the academy. Tenured scholars, who are mostly white and male, largely make the rules that determine who else gets to join the tenured ranks. This involves what sociologists call boundary work, or the practice of a group setting rules to determine who is good enough to join. Practice seeing these habits and devise ways to change them. All right, and so that concludes all the material that I wanted to share with you today.